Hello, welcome back. Now we're on to Objective 2 to corroborate the score on the psychology essay and to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of how the rubric works. So let's get started. Taking a look at the rubric, for criterion A, the psychology essay we just looked at actually does not have the research question clearly stated in the introduction. I realize that it's in the title page, so it's pretty clear, but it's not actually stated in the introduction. And it may seem like this is kind of being a little picky, but this is how the rubric works. So to make sure that our students are scoring all the points that they deserve, we have to make sure to remind them, make sure you put the research question really clearly up front in the introduction. You'll notice on the rubric, so you'll notice in the actual rubric, if you do put the research question in and it's clearly stated and it's sharply focused, they would get 2 points there. So unfortunately, this part can only score 0 out of 2. For the next criterion, assessing the extent to which the introduction makes it clear how the research question relates to existing knowledge on the topic, and also the significance and why this is worthy of investigation. So you could see in the essay that there's some attempt to establish a research question in the context, and you can also see that they do a pretty good job of exploring the actual significance of the topic. So you can see in the actual essay, they do have a good context in terms of background, in terms of the definitions, and they do a good job of kind of deciding why this particular definition should be used, explaining that choice. There are parts where you can see there's like vague estimates that are just thousands of dollars of revenue. It would be nice if the student could actually look up how much revenue is there, and that would actually increase the significance of why this is important. They do, however, make the argument that it is important because it does affect the sports industry, and it does actually affect how we play sports and how that process works. So in terms of both economic and just appreciation of the sport and getting better at it. So the significance is clear. But when it comes to the rubric, they can only score a 1 out of 2, again, because they didn't really establish the research question in the context. They overviewed different kinds of studies, but they didn't really locate any connection between these studies and the findings and why these studies are important and relate to the research question. So again, they kind of overviewed these different kinds of studies, but connecting them back to the research question and what they mean and why, how they'll be impacting the study or how they'll be actually be useful for the research question at hand is not clear. So it only can score a 1 out of 2 on the introduction. The next section is part C. It's the investigation. This is again kind of how well it's planned, range of sources, the data that's gathered, and if you look at it in terms of the planning, the investigation and planning is clear. There are 3 subjects of study and 3 main studies. Findings are being applied. The range of studies, though, is lacking. Like, why only 3 main studies? And just showing their general correlations does not necessarily map out a specific sort of context and research process. So also the connection to the question is, again, only general and implied by the topic itself. So yeah, we're studying visualization and how it affects athletic performance. And so the studies that she looked at, these 3 studies, do actually show that there's a correlation there, but there's no real specific analysis in terms of what these kinds of findings do and what their findings, how their findings relate to the question more specifically. Also, the studies themselves are just sort of presented. It's not really clear why did she choose only these 3 studies or these 3 studies in particular. So there's a limited range of appropriate sources, so that right there would score it a 2. I feel like only having 3 main studies is not enough to really warrant a proper investigation. Certainly, I would say a good source is a good amount of sources is 10 as a sort of minimum, with 5 of them being really solid academic research as a bare minimum. So a sufficient range of appropriate information would involve that. There is some planning in the investigation, you can tell. There are 3 subjects of study, and then there's 3 main findings, and so she's going to be kind of looking at those. So there's a general sort of plan there. The next section is part D, knowledge and understanding of the topic. So again, here we're looking at how much research did the student do. So in general, you don't have to be looking at comprehensive knowledge. They don't have to know everything in the topic, but they should know a good amount in terms of the principal lines of the inquiry in the relevant field. So they should have done enough research to know, like, what are the main kind of topics that are being discussed lately regarding this question, and then locating their study and their analysis in regards to that discussion. So in this essay, the knowledge remains fairly general. There is some movement towards some specificity with the Richardson theories on multiple senses and impacts on neural pathways, but these findings are then generally discussed. So it's not really a specific kind of conversation that's being brought up and related to the actual question at hand. There is, however, an awareness of an academic context, so it does score a 2 out of 4. Again, awareness is different from precisely locating the investigation in the conversation at hand. So again, the problem here is that it's fairly general, and we would want to see the students getting really more specific with the kinds of concepts and theories and relationships that are being discussed. The next section is part E. It's reasoned argument. In this part, the argument is basically the student is saying that the visualization does affect performance, and she describes how this does happen, not so much how it happens, in what ways or to what extent, but that it does happen. And the research does indicate that, and she gives examples of how that's taking place. So this essay is in many ways more of a report as opposed to an actual discussion / analysis sort of essay. So while there's a general reference to psychological concepts, there's the relationships between the various factors of influence are not clear. There's different kinds of things a student could do. The first thing I think in terms of analysis that they could do is to give more specific examples of the kind of visualization that each of the athletes did, the specific kinds of and ways that they visualized, and then relate that back to the field and make some kinds of inferences or conclusions or evaluations about the extent to which those evaluations or those visualizations were actually affecting their performance. And again, you could get more specific questions like, are there other factors influencing his process? Perhaps Phelps had a less stressful scenario. Just getting more specific about the swimming in general and the conditions associated with this type of competition that might engender a greater or lesser impact from visualization. There's different kinds of things that the student could do to kind of deepen the analysis here. So you'll also notice there's just a couple little typos. In this particular paragraph with the Olympics, I wasn't sure, that didn't make sense. It seemed like sort of a tangent. It didn't seem like it was even really a part of the analysis. It was just sort of like a side note that sort of affected the argument but didn't really do anything with that. And again, with all of the examples that she uses, including Jordan and the golfer, there's very little evidence of their actual visualization. And this actually causes problems both for the analysis and evaluation section as well as for the formal presentation. So you can see how it says here, this famous athlete attributes a majority of his accomplishments to his visualization. Well, that's the kind of thing that would really need to be cited. And, you know, having a quote here is there, but that's not cited either. So getting a lot more specific evidence to actually analyze the way that he visualized would be really helpful. Just assuming that he did do that based on this one sort of quote that he expects things of himself before he actually does them is not necessarily an in-depth sort of analysis or evidence that you can even analyze for an extended essay. So just to kind of finish up this process, you have all the way up into evaluation skills and reasoned argument. You can see how not having evidence really does affect her ability to make any kinds of conclusions. And there's very little nuanced choices in terms of the effects, types of effects, extents of the effects, and that sort of thing. And so the highest it can score there is a 2 out of 4. As previously discussed, I think the terminology itself is pretty general. And I'm not a psychology expert, but I know that in the field of psychology, there's going to be more specific kinds of terminology about visualization and the different types. And so we really want to push the students to use those kinds of concepts and get more specific with the terminology for the subject. In this essay, it's pretty general, and so that's why I would score it a 2 out of 4. The clarity is actually really strong. I think it's a pretty strong essay overall. It's pretty clear, but because the terminology is so general, and they don't really push themselves, they only can score a 2 out of 4 there. The conclusion, I thought, actually is pretty decent. It has the conclusions of the essay. It does reflect what was stated before, and there are some sort of implied, at least, questions for future research there. In terms of formal presentation, this is a place where the essay really struggled, and so this is a place that supervisors can really help make sure that we get these points for sure. And I think, as previously talked about in the first lesson, you have a situation where if you don't give references for quotations, or if you don't have a bibliography for something you talked about, the highest you can score is a 0. And that is the case here. The student didn't present all of the citations that were referenced in her works cited. There were several missing: the Richardson, the Seaborn, the Murphy, and also it's not formatted correctly, so you can't tell what kind of source this is. Is it a journal article, or is it a book? Is it a magazine? Is it an interview? You really wouldn't be able to tell. And APA has a specific format that you can look up on the internet, on any OWL Purdue website. The one that we looked at before would have it, where you can find really specific guidance in terms of how to format those things so that we can understand what those are. And so you just want to make sure that the students are using whichever format, APA for science stuff, MLA for more humanities kinds of things, so that they can score the full points there. Alright, so the final kind of thing we need to look at is the part J. It's the abstract. And in the essay you can see how the abstract is actually toward the beginning of the essay. It takes place after the table of contents. And you can see in the abstract it does a good job of explaining the conclusions, and where it really fails is that it doesn't really give us too much in terms of the scope and the method of the investigation. It could be a lot more specific there. It does give the reference to the actual studies that are being looked at and the people who are going to be analyzed in terms of the actual objects of the study, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining what kind of theories these studies produced or found, and how those are going to be analyzed in the specific sort of question at hand here. And the question itself is somewhat vague, and so that's something that you want to make sure that they're being really clear about. Up here, the question is phrased, to what extent does visualization affect an athlete's performance? And that's a little different. To what extent is very different, as opposed to just investigating the effect. And I know that seems really nitpicky, but you just want to make sure that they put the full question in, and that it's really clear what that is, because evaluators can mark them down for that. So looking back at the rubric, I would score this as a 0 out of 2, unfortunately, because I did not feel like the research question was really clear. I felt like it was implied, and it wasn't it wasn't the actual question that was actually being asked based on the title page. You could see how some people might say that it's in there, it just isn't absolutely clear, so I could see how this might score a 1 as well. In terms of a holistic judgment, the student did definitely do some research, and so it shows some evidence of intellectual initiative and depth of understanding and insight, but it doesn't show considerable, and so you really have to kind of make that judgment there. How much research did they actually do? So after you've done all of this kind of, different parts, you add it all up and you score it. I gave this a 15 total. Coordinator gave it a 14, and the actual IB essay evaluator gave it a 13. So you can see how, in general, this would score a D. You can also see the things that this student really could do to improve. Things like having the research question really clear in the abstract and up front in the introduction. And also making sure that you're citing all of your sources in a clear format, and making sure all of your quotations have a citation. Other things are, just increasing the kind of actual analysis and making sure that you're asking a specific kind of question that's going to allow you to really look at specific nuances and make some kind of conclusions and inferences yourself. So that concludes the process of corroborating. I hope this was insightful and helpful, and please let me know if you have any further questions, or if you would like to just talk about how to grade extended essays. I'm totally available.